Hi, it's me, Mrs. Hartzell. Since you're all obsessed with finding my new YouTube channel, I thought today I would read chapter 12 of The Birchbark House out loud to you so you don't have to read it on your own. So, here we go. All you have to do is sit back and listen. We're going to start with chapter 12, but this also brings us to our next and last season, Zigwan, which is spring. So, are you ready? Here we go. Chapter 12, Maple Sugar Time. Everyone in the cabin heard the far-off creaking and groaning, the boom of the lake ice. The lake had started to move again. The ice was breaking up. Obviously, because it's starting to get warmer. So when it gets warmer, the ice melts. Once the waves began, huge sheets of ice shoved against each other, pushing towers into the air. Nokomis, Mama, Dee Dee, Pinch, Angeline, and Omakias all ran outside, gazed on the horizon, and saw the crackling and snapping waves of the ice. They felt the surge of lake water in their blood. They knew, at last, that the back of winter was entirely broken. Thank goodness, because it was a really long winter. Omakias grinned. Her smile was now whole. New teeth had grown in over the winter. She was older. Soon, spring plants would poke up through dead leaves. The new heads of fern would curl, buds would burst, roots draw up spring water, fresh new leaves unfurl. Fat lake trout would sleepily rise from the bottom, hungry to be caught. Sisselquet and whitefish would fill their nets. They would be able to think of something other than the next bite of food. They would live again, truly live. Angeline went to the mission school every day now. She was learning to write her name, the white man's language, and she taught Omakias the things she learned. Using a pointed stick to write in wet mud, Angeline showed Omakias and Nokomis the meaningful signs, which looked like odd tracks. What animal would leave these? Omakias teased. Be patient, Nokomis counseled. Let's find out what your sister has learned. They're letters, Angeline said, eager to share her knowledge. One follows the next. You look at them just like tracks. You read them. They have a meaning and a sound. Like the English language, like we learn? Letters and sounds make words. That's a great idea. Like our picture writing, Nokomis said. The girls knew people like Fishtail's father, Day Thunder, who kept the records for the religious gatherings. The Middlewind and etched stories and songs on scrolls made of birchbark. They had seen some birchbark writing, and they knew that Nokomis could etch pictures into bark too. She also knew where certain marks had been placed upon lake rocks long ago. Some of the marks were made by the spirits. Some were made by humans. Others were drawn by a giant race of people who had lived on Earth in the old days and had disappeared. Angeline's description of the white men's tracks interested Omakias in spite of herself. The system sounded incredible. Sounds, meanings, but the idea made sense. Thereafter, to learn the language, the letters and sounds became a source of amusement, for the evenings were still long. Can you imagine they sat around and worked on their letters and sounds? Ah, said Angeline, tracking the letters on the rough stone of the hearth. Ah, said Omakias, B, C, D. She learned to make the pictures, and she learned to make the sounds, slowly, all of them. Words would follow, Angeline said, but Omakias could not believe they would happen. She remembered the last winter before the sickness began. She had seen Fishtail walking from the mission school. Had he learned to make the white man's tracks? Had he learned to write his name? Had he learned to read the words of the treaty so that his people could not be cheated of land? Bozo, called Fishtail one day. He was at the door of the cabin calling hello to his relatives. Grandma greeted him kindly, for he was ashamed of his thinness and weakness. She brought him inside. His hair was short and wild as porcupine quills, his face starved and shallow with grief. Because remember, he lost his wife. 10 snow. No longer did he wear the proud, somewhat disdainful look he'd worn when walking seriously among the woods, his pipe cradled in his arms. He was still Hawking, with a strong and handsome face, but her eyes were more human, humble, gentle. He gazed pityingly down at Omakias and touched her hair. Little frog, he said, and there was a hint of smile in his voice, as though to see her brought him comfort. My good wife loved you as her little sister. You made her laugh with your quirk ways. She told me you were much loved by the bear people. She told me also that you had a bird named Andeg. Andeg, called Omakians, and like a dark arrow her crow swooped down and landed on her shoulder. Andeg looked curiously at Fishtail, wondering whether he had possibly had something to feed him. The bird danced from foot to foot, took a strand of Omakia's hair in his beak, but did not pull. Andeg tucked the hair behind Omakias' ear, just like a grandfather soothing a child to sleep. Ah, said Fishtail in wonder, you are much loved by these creatures. Over his shoulder, Fishtail carried a blanket, meaning that he had much to say and planned to spend the night. Didi greeted him, holding him by the arms, and Nokomis stirred up the fire, adding a stick there, a bit of wood in exactly the right spot to make it blaze up cheerfully. Mama had made a good stew, filled with flanky chunks of fish, and the kettle bubbled hot, hung above the hearth fire. Fishtail took off his big moose hide mitts, and Angeline dished up a wooden bowl of soup, eager for him to sit and warm himself, because he was related as a cross cousin, and also because he had been the husband of her friend. She was familiar around him and not shy at all. She tried to cheer him up, to bring a smile to his face by teasing him gently. Didi needs snowshoes all winter, but you, Angeline pointed, with her lips at Fishtail, already have yours on, eh? Fishtail gave a little smile, but there was still so much sadness in him to laugh. He waggled his feet. They were big. It was true, almost as big as snowshoes, as big as old Tallow's huge long ones. They come in handy, Fishtail acknowledged. If I lose a paddle, I've always got one attached. He took great gulps of the fish broth, and slowly feeling better, he warmed to the talk with Didi. I wonder what they're going to talk about. They were planning this year's sugaring. Oh, the maple sugar, which comes from maple trees. A time everyone looked forward to with joy and excitement, as much as ricing, maybe even more. For when the maple sap began to run, it meant that the warmer days, pleasant sun, all the beauties of spring were close at hand. This sweetness just at the raggedy end of winter. Nokomis was excited as a girl, and her enthusiasm made everyone smile with affection. But the Creator expects us to be ready. While you talk, you men work. She herself was smoothing out a paddle to use in stirring the syrup, and just the day before Didi had started hollowing a peeled, smooth piece of basswood for a trough. Now Didi asked for the use of Omakian's gun-barreled flesher. Remember, that was her gift her dad brought back. She brought it quickly from its place in the corner. She was glad to find another use for Didi's gift, beside the usual unpleasant one of scraping hides, because we know how much she loves that. Taking the hide flesher in his hand, Didi sharpened the end well on his sharpening stone. Holding the barrow in his strong fingers like a chisel, he hit the other end with his mallet. Tapping long slices of wood away from the inside of the log. Every strip of wood he tapped from the inside, Pinch grabbed and threw into the fire. The trough grew smoother, deeper. Like a trough, like kind of like what we have on our houses that catches the rain, you know. The tuff grew smoother, deeper. Fishtail, meanwhile, looked peacefully into the leaping flames. I hope that as I'm reading this, you're making a picture in your mind of what these characters are doing. You get to work too, Angeline said, smiling. She tossed him a bit of venison jerky, though for him to chew on it when he stared into the fire. The family sugaring place was at the other end of the island. When they traveled to the sugar bush, the family packed as lightly as possible. Once they arrived, they would use the frame set up last year for their big sugaring house. There was a smaller wigwam where the tools were stored. There usually was a food cache buried last fall, filled with good things that had lain far beneath the snow. But this year, Dee Dee had already made a trip to the end of the island and raided the cache. To keep from starving, they had already eaten their store during the lean moon. When they arrived, the first thing Mama did was unroll the reed mats for the roof of the shelter, then the blankets, then take out new paddles and the cooking pot. Dee Dee dragged a big kettle and more wooden troughs and paddles from the small storage house. Anything that wasn't at the sugaring place or anything that broke or wore out, they could make for themselves. Nokomis and Omakians arranged the food they brought. There were packets of split, dried fish, a makak of special powdered fish, moose meat, a little Manonian traded with deer meat, smoked fish, and a bag of dried pumpkin flowers to thicken soups. Nashke, said Nokomis, happy they had so much. We'll have a good feast. So this is like a extreme contrast to what they lived through during the winter, where they weren't even sure if they were going to have food for a day. Now they have this big old feast. Once the soup was in the making, Nokomis left Angeline to stir and called Omakias to come along and help carve taps to open the maples. The two wandered a bit until Nokomis found a good ironwood tree. She took out her sharp hatchet and expertly chopped into the tree at regular angles. She made a series of perfect cuts down the side of the tree and then chopped sideways and split from the tree 10 perfect wedges of the hard iron wood. She did this until she had a huge sackful of wedges, which Omakias lugged back to the camp. For 2 days they prepared, knowing that the sap was just about to start running. There was a feeling to that time before the sap began, a quietness that had the going out taste of winter. All that happened in the snow and cold, the storytelling, and the sadness too, was not forgotten, but it was left behind in peace and love. Omakias opened herself to the warming wind. Before then, the sweetness of maple waited, the warmth of the sun. Omakias, Twilight, and Little Bee carted heavy rocks from the lakeshore to weigh down the Makakun, and then hauled wood from the fire. Omakian's arms were tired, and her cousins too. They complained impatiently to each other as they hunted for the right-sized stones or hauled load after load of wood in their arms, dumping it near the big kettle, which was boiling and steaming away. As yet, not one taste of the maple syrup, just the cold, sweet sap. It was always this way before the first taste. The boiling down seemed to take so endlessly long. Pinch watched jealously, jumped on a log to observe Grandma's paddle when it came up, and dipped back down again. Still not ready. Still not. Still not. Then, ready. Onto the surface of a big macaque filled with clean snow, Grandma dribbled a thin, dark, gold stream of syrup. Pinch could hardly wait for it to cool. Gum sugar! He grabbed it while it was still a soft rope, swung the strand into his mouth, and ran, for once quiet instead of yelling. Pinch quiet? What? Only because his mouth was stuffed. Andag was caught up in the excitement, and he jumped from foot to foot, nearly tumbling over Omakias' shoulder as Angeline poured out more syrup and then helped Grandma ladle the rest into a sugaring trough. He pecked at a bit of the syrup, but didn't seem to like the sticky feel of it on his beak, and shook his head comically. He put his head in the snow, wiped his beak back and forth, but couldn't remove the hardening syrup. He flew up to a low branch and glared down at them, betrayed, preening his feathers, making his feathers sticky with the syrup too. And I'm sure we all have had our interaction with syrup before, and we know how sticky it can get. Omakias licked up a dollop of thick syrup. The first taste usually made her smile. Not this time. Sadness overwhelmed her when she tasted the sweetness. She instantly recalled the special day she spent with Niwu on the shore of the lake. On that day, long ago, last summer, she had freed him from the tight bonds of his dicanigan, let him tumble and play. When it came time for her to put him back, she sweetened his confinement by placing her last bit of sugar on his tongue. "Chickadee, my brother," she cried to Niwu under her breath. She looked around. Pinch was running and jumping, striking out with a stick and pretending to hunt. Nokomis was stirring the syrup using a dancing kind of smooth movement with her arms. Mama was putting together a stew and Dee Dee was off somewhere with Fishtail, planning ceremonies that will be held during the sugaring, not far from their camp. Angeline looked at her and said, "Nishimi, go get some more wood." She, Omakias, was the only one thinking of Niwu. The knowledge made her lonely. If only she could talk to him, look into his cheerful, up-slanted eyes, share with him her feelings that he never laughed at, play with him in her arms. She missed him terribly. So much so that her heart seemed to drop right through her stomach with a thud. Muffling her cries, she ran from camp straight into the woods. Angeline was surprised. Usually her sister did not fetch wood with such enthusiasm. "Hoa!" she called after her little sister. "Mitchwitch!" Omakias knew that she would not come back, however, and Angeline could fetch her own wood. She ran with an angry heart, breathing hard, skimming away as fast as she could, and she got away from everyone before she sat down on a little patch of dry, sunny ground. At last, it was all right to sob and sob, to let herself cry as much as she wanted to. But the strange thing was, as soon as she sat down, she didn't feel like crying anymore. She heard the song of the white-throated sparrow. It sang again and again. She was soothed by the sweetness of the piercing refrain. She smiled. Niwu's spirit was comforting her. Her eyelids got heavy, the sun warmed her, and she was just about lost in a dream when she was startled by the crackle of sticks and twigs, the shuffle of feet, the interested snuffling, and most of all, the commanding and unmistakable odor of bear. They were with her. Standing quiet at the edge of the little spot of sun, the two young bears gazed curiously, knowingly at Omakians. Andag flew down, suddenly, as though he, the little crow, had to protect her from her brothers. And remember, her brothers are the bears. The two bears startled a bit at the crow's angry charge, but then shrugged and ignored him. "It's okay," said Omakias, and Andag returned to her shoulder. The bears continued to look closely at Omakians, peering with their dim bear eyes, taking in every dot of her scent, remembering it all, knowing. Omakias wished that she had something to give them. She had run away from camp with nothing more than a handful of sema in her pocket. They kept looking at her, waiting and watching. The only thing she could think of to give them, in the end, was some human advice. She decided to warn them about other humans and the danger they posed. "There's a woman," Omakias said softly. "Her name is Old Tallow. She's my aunt, but you must stay far away from her." The young bear's ears twitched a little. They seemed to listen closely. "Be careful, too," Omakias went on. "When you see something better to eat than usual out in the woods, if it's hanging up out of reach, there might be a pit underneath. That's a trap. You'll fall and die. And guns. My brothers Run fast from men carrying big sticks on their shoulders. Stay away from them. Don't go near the humans. Either the Nashnakbag or the Gichi Mukame. Stay deep in the woods. Hide if you hear Otalo's dogs. Omakias reached into her pocket and took out the little handful of Asima. She put the tobacco on the ground. When she did, she knew she was asking for something, but she wasn't sure what it was. Words she had not expected came from her lips. Will you give me your medicine? She asked this, but her voice was uncertain. She really didn't know what she meant. She felt embarrassed at herself. I'm pitiful, she said, just as her grandmother did sometimes when praying. I don't know anything. I want to know your medicine. I want to be like Nokomis. I want strong medicines to save my family. Tears came into Omakias' eyes, and she could hardly see, hardly notice when the bears wheeled and silently disappeared. Help me, she whispered to the ground. Help me. Once she finished talking, she lifted her face and looked around. Her bear brothers had vanished, and she felt better. She set to work gathering a huge load of dry sticks, dead branches, torn off during the winter by heavy snow and ice. As she was piling the branches higher and higher, she saw, on the side of a dry piece of birchwood, the gray hoof of a mushroom. A tiny voice whispered in her head, a low muttering. When she picked up the branch, the voice grew louder, but she still couldn't make out individual words. She added the branch to her pile, bound the pile with the thong, carried it back to her camp on her shoulders. From time to time, as she walked back to camp through the woods, she heard a small sound, a word or two, muffled under the snow and leaves. By the time she reached the sugaring camp, she felt a little bit afraid. What were those voices? What did the whispering mean? Standing in the clearing safe, she peered into the maze of branches and undergrowth. Shining scraps of snow lighted the ground as far as she could see. The sound of voices, small and whispery, still floated through the depths of the woods. What do you think the voices are? What are they telling her? What took you so long? Angeline said, a bit annoyed. She burned her finger in the process of pouring some hot syrup, and she was hurting badly. What's wrong with you? Omakias put down her load and told her sister that she had something important to do. So do I, Angeline yelled back. Omakias walked over to Nokomis. She was fashioning small cones of birch bark for the sugar. She had saved a string of duckbills, too, that she'd fill with hard sugar for a special treat. Omakias sat down beside her. Nokomis, said Omakias, her voice soft and troubled. I talked to my bear brothers. I listened to them like you told me. Immediately, Nokomis set down her work, wiped her hands on her skirt, and brought her granddaughter over to a wide fallen log to sit with her. She smoothed Omakias' hair down to either side and looked keenly into her face. We're going to stop right there. That is not all of chapter 12, but we're going to finish chapter 12 in class. But keep all of these points in mind, especially there's foreshadowing about the mushrooms and medicine and the bear spirit and the mood that is happening throughout chapter 12. So you're welcome. I did your homework for you. All you had to do is listen. See you tomorrow.